Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
This is the Look Back at 50 Years of EPA, a limited podcast series where we interview practitioners in the development of environmental law and EPA.
Today on the podcast, we have Mr. Barry Breen. Mr. Breen is currently the Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator of the EPA's Office of Land and Emergency Management. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
And thank you. What a pleasure. Thank you.
This podcast really focuses on accomplishments and developments in the field of environmental law. Specifically, we're celebrating EPA's 50-year anniversary. So on that note, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in the field of environmental law?
There's a little bit of fortuity of timing. I'll explain. I finished law school in 1981 and had an Army commitment. I had been in Army ROTC in college and had a commitment to be on active duty in the Army for 4 years when I finished law school. So I finished and took the bar exam, and in mid-August of 1981 showed up at the Army in the General Counsel's office. And by just fortuity, the lawyer who had been covering environmental matters left the Army. He had finished his 4 years. So they had an opening. I was new, there I was, and I got slotted into it almost by the luck of the timing. But I must tell you, within weeks, it felt like home, maybe even shorter than weeks. It felt like home practically right away. And I'm blessed and lucky that the timing worked out that way.
Yeah, it was fate.
Yeah, exactly.
So had you been interested in the field before? Like, what were some of your drivers?
I didn't take environmental law in law school. It was taught by a famous professor who is Dick Stewart, one of the leaders. But at the time, I just didn't know I would love it so much. I thought I might do criminal work, and I did do that for a time later, or I thought I might do something else, but environmental law just wasn't on my screen. It would have been terrific to take Dick Stewart's course, but I missed it.
Yeah. So before you joined the agency, I mean, had you held any other legal jobs before that to kind of help you prepare? So
I was in the Army for 4 years and was one of the Army's environmental lawyers in the General Counsel's office. At that time, the General Counsel's office was a very small office, about 16 lawyers for all fields of law. So one lawyer would do intelligence work, and another lawyer, maybe two, would do government procurement. But there were two of us who did environmental law. One who did the regulatory work and the civil works work that the Army Corps of Engineers leads, and then me, who did the work of the Army as a traditional military organization and all of the consequences of that: chemical disposal, air pollution, water pollution. I did that in the Army General Counsel's office. Did that for 4 years. Then I left and went to the Justice Department, and I was in the Justice Department Criminal Division in the Organized Crime and Racketeering section. And when I left Justice, I went to the Environmental Law Institute, and I was at ELI for 6 years, and then came to EPA. So before coming to EPA, really 3 other jobs: Army lawyer, Justice Department, Criminal Division, and Environmental Law Institute.
Yeah, it's a lot of very differing experiences. What made you ultimately decide to work at EPA?
It was a couple of things, at least a couple. One is the first role I had at EPA was in the Federal Facilities Enforcement Program, where EPA is enforcing environmental laws at other federal agencies like the Army, or for that matter, any of the DoD components or the Energy Department. It was a world I knew pretty well because I had been in that work for a while. I came to EPA partly because of the mission, which is so easy to be enthusiastic about. And the Congress had just passed a law in 1992 to make federal agencies comply with the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, in the same ways in which private entities do. It's called the Federal Facilities Compliance Act. That was brand new in 1992. And EPA was standing up an office to manage that by, again, probably fortuities. They needed a number 2 person in that office, and I applied for that. So it was just good luck, and to some extent, good friends who made sure I knew about an opportunity to apply.
Right. So whenever you first started at EPA, was that one of your first projects, was the RCRA?
Yes. In 1992, when I started, the law was brand new. And so setting up an implementation system for that law, at the same time we were doing the Superfund work, which had already existed for several years. Those were 2 of the big projects right at the start.
Interesting. Okay, tell me some more about your earlier experiences at the agency. Successes, failures. I think people are really interested in sort of how things began and how we got where we are today.
So I joined the EPA when it was already a going concern. I joined in 1992, and I've been there since. But there was already a pretty extensive structure. People knew how rulemakings moved. People knew how enforcement cases got approved and referred. People knew how reorganizations happened. Those kinds of structures were in place. So I guess you could say at that point, we were already building on the foundations of those who founded the agency in the 1970s. But what we were doing then in the 90s was adapting. And so it was a time of settling in, a time itself of then reaffirming some core principles, and then to some extent modernizing. There was no internet to speak of. And one of the things I remember is everybody was within earshot of a loudspeaker. And periodically during the day, it was kind of like in middle school, at least for me, somebody would come on the loudspeaker and say something like, "There will be a meeting in the auditorium at 3 p.m. on health and wellness. You are all invited." And some people went and some people didn't, but you just kind of expected that the loudspeaker would tell you things over the course of the day. The administrator will be holding a press conference in the courtyard at 4 p.m. We're trying to keep it open to press. So if you wouldn't mind using the back door instead of the front door this afternoon when you leave, please do. That kind of thing. It was really a charming, old-fashioned need to do that. Of course, that was soon overtaken by a LAN and then an internet. But so we did a lot there. We were just rolling out the EPA, toxic release inventory, which the internet seems perfectly made for, but it was conceptualized before there was an internet, and you got a book with the toxic release inventory in it. So there was a time in the 90s where what we were doing was taking a structure that had been thoughtfully and lovingly constructed in the 70s and now adapting it to new challenges. And then, of course, we moved from a downtown set of modern but crowded and often issues with indoor air quality in the waterfront area to the quarters we're in now in about 4 or 5 blocks, I suppose, from the White House. That was a big deal. The buildings now are stately and historic and helped to make us feel like we were accepted in the Washington structure and not just sort of camping out. At the same time, that neighborhood that we used to be in, that neighborhood has become a whole new area, and it's now a terrific and fun place. I go back just for the joy of it. But at the time, the buildings themselves were not nearly anything to brag about.
Well, so since you've been at EPA, why don't you tell us a little bit about, what do you think the most important program or action that you've been involved in has been?
Sure. And let me elaborate a little bit with, beside my day job, which is at the EPA, I also teach environmental law in the evenings. I started about 30 years ago at American University Law School. And earlier this year, I as well taught a course at the law school at Catholic University of America here in DC. One of the things I'm proudest of are the ways in which government lawyers are part of a tradition now, 50 plus years of environmental lawyering. To the best of my knowledge, the first law school course called environmental law was in the 1969-1970 academic year. If there's an earlier one than that, I haven't found it. Environmental law as a field, as a self-conscious discipline in which people can practice and make a career and do good at. Environmental law as a field probably dates to 1969, 1970. And it's no coincidence that the Environmental Law Institute was founded then. The Environmental Law Institute was self-consciously designed to establish the field of environmental law. And it's more than just a name. It's by having a field, it means that the foundational values of environmental protection get considered in transactions and in the way companies day-to-day manage their work. It just becomes a seat at the table when environmental law is a field. Just like a labor lawyer, just like a tax lawyer, just like a securities lawyer, environmental law has a seat at the table. It doesn't mean that's the end of the discussion, but it means environmental law is in the discussion. One of the things I'm proudest of are the ways in which government lawyers join right in to those discussions. Environmental law might be different than most because it's often a three-way discussion. In lots of fields, it's two-way. I'm told that in labor law, it's labor and management. And in tax law, it's often the taxpayer and the taxing agency, the Internal Revenue Service, for example. But in environmental law, it's often a three-way discussion. The regulated entity, the nonprofit, non-governmental organization, the NGO, and the government, the regulator. So that three-way nature of environmental law is either unique or at least unusual. The environmental law moot court, I credit them with pointing this out, at least for me. Pace Law School started the environmental law moot court, and Professor Jeff Miller there is the one who explained to me that it was going to be a three-way moot court, not a two-way moot court. So all through the 80s and 90s, when it was getting started at least, the teams would be three up on the podium: corporate, nonprofit, and government. So government has a role, but clearly not the only role. But the thing I'm proudest of, I think, is the way in which government lawyers have become part of this institution of environmental law as a field, giving a voice to these values. We don't always win, but we're pretty often at the table. I think that makes a change in the real world. Certainly different than it would have been if there was no environmental law. Because I think the nature of environmental issues are that the environment would get used up and consumed if one didn't stop and think about it. So by having environmental lawyers as a profession and government environmental lawyers helping to mediate that, I think it makes a difference in the way environmental protection results are achieved. Does that make sense, Emily?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. No one else has put it that way yet. But it's a great way to look at it.
I guess just to say another way, to say in a quicker way, the default would often be the environment gets used up. But we have a chance at switching that default because we have a field of environmental law. And government lawyers are not the only members of the field. They're one of sort of three parts of it, but a pretty indispensable part of it. And I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, definitely. As EPA has progressed over the years and the decades, I mean, what do you see as one of their most important milestones or actions that's really developed over the past years?
You know, I want to get to that question in just a minute by setting a foundation. When I think about environmental law, I realize that EPA is indispensably a central part, but among government lawyers, EPA is really a member of a rich family. So besides the EPA, government lawyers practice environmental law at the Interior Department and at the Army Corps of Engineers for the wetlands program, at the Commerce Department in the endangered species work that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, does. The Forest Service in the Agriculture Department has a critical role in environmental law. The Coast Guard and the Oil Pollution Act and its related functions. And for that matter, my old colleagues at the Defense Department and counterparts at the Energy Department, they do environmental law. So I want to come back to what EPA has done, but I should acknowledge that at the federal level, EPA is a sibling with very prestigious brothers and sisters. And I guess just to make sure, environmental law is such that federal law depends on state law. And so the state attorneys general and the state environmental agencies typically have lawyers who are themselves indispensable. So all of this leads to a set of regulators, co-regulators, governors of environmental law. And to your question, what would be the accomplishment? Here's a proposal. Congress has enacted environmental laws typically one at a time. A Clean Air Act is enacted, a Clean Water Act, Superfund, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, all of them one at a time, often dating from the same period, the 1970s and early 80s, but still one at a time. Environmental law is not a single code. There's not unlike the tax code, where there's a single code, and some other fields where there's one code. Environmental law is really a set of codes. And one of the accomplishments I'm proudest of on behalf of all of us is that we have woven them together into an effective, functioning body of law. There is something called environmental law. There is something that works together, not without hard work. And so I guess the accomplishment is to take these statutes and make a reality out of them. That would be the accomplishment that I would say comes to mind when I think about the environmental bar across the agencies.
Essentially creating an entirely new field of law that works cohesively.
Yeah, especially because it's kind of young, right? It's before 1970, we had some things that we would now call environmental law, some of the tort matters in Nuisance, some of the natural resource matters that certainly bear on overconsumption, but until 1970, didn't really come together the way it does now. And so what we've got is this achievement of really two generations, a generation that founded it and then a generation that kept it alive and adapted it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Nuisance is definitely making a comeback in these climate change litigation cases.
Well, that's right.
Who would have thought?
That's right. There's this famous quote. I'll get it wrong, but it's something like most environmental issues can really be understood through the frame of nuisance. Of course, now we have statutes, but nuisance law is remarkably prescient in the way that it set a foundation.
Totally. I think everyone agrees that the world looks a little different in 2020. I mean, everyone's working conditions are differently, and we're thinking about things long term with a different mindset. What do you think EPA should be focusing on right now?
Yeah, there's so very much. That's a really hard question, because to almost say what it should be focusing on would leave out something. I have a hard time thinking of something I could competently say can be left out. I would have to be part of a group discussion on that. I'm not even sure I would agree with where the group got to. So I don't have a good, solid straw to put forward myself.
Well, how about, what do you wish you had known when you started at EPA that you know now?
Yeah. So EPA, I grew up in the Army, right? My first job was in the Army. I was an Army officer. I had an office in the Pentagon. The Army culture is one in which the senior officer says what he or she wants, and the junior officers make it happen. That's the way it works. And EPA's culture is quite different. EPA feels more like a law school faculty, where men and women are recognized as experts in their own right, respected among one another, and decisions are typically, or at least frequently, reached collegially, endorsed and moved on. I had heard that when I first came to the EPA, but I had not lived in that culture, having come from the Army. I think for the first few months, I didn't quite know how to get a document from draft to done. But I had good friends, and they walked me through and helped me step aside from some mistakes I made. I think if I had to do it again, I would have sought them out even on the first day and not waited a month or two or three, I suppose, to learn the collegial nature of the EPA. Other than that, which is all joy, right? How much fun to be in a situation where decisions get made with participation. Other than that, I think that's probably the thing that comes to mind the first.
I mean, I know we're living in definitely a different world now than even you mentioned before when you started at EPA in the 90s. There wasn't really an internet. You couldn't instantly message someone and get a response. I mean, how do you feel like this current generation, this next generation is going to be relating to environmental issues? Social media. I feel like people are a lot more aware at a younger age of our environmental issues.
Yeah, it's a great question, because information travels so much more quickly, but decision-making hasn't really speeded up commensurately. So, for example, I can go on the EPA's website and I can tell you what the air quality is. If you tell me a zip code, I can probably tell you the air quality today. I can probably tell you recent toxic release inventory report. I have a son and his family in Jacksonville, Florida, and I was able to go online and tell them about nearby chemical facilities and the quality of their drinking water just from my desk, and just from knowing which website to turn to, and within, half an hour. So information is rapid and extensive and in many cases free, but decision-making hasn't sped up. So in fact, maybe decision-making has slowed down. So rulemaking is counted in years, not weeks. And so it does make it especially important for EPA lawyers and lawyers among co-regulators at the state and federal level to realize that we are responding to stakeholders for whom we work, taxpayers, citizens. We are responding to them in which they know what they need right away, and we are still getting them what they need in a time frame measured about the same as it was measured before many of them were born in the 1950s and 60s. And so that means we have to work harder and smarter. And that's an important challenge. I would feel awful if we didn't get them what they needed when they needed it. And yet we don't have administrative mechanisms that have sped up commensurately. So I think that's an important challenge.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, unless there's any other developments in the field that you want to talk about, I think we've reached our last question, which is definitely chime in if there's other issues or topics you want to discuss. But my last question is, where do you think environmental law and the EPA will be in another 50 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there was a time when I thought, wouldn't it be tidy if environmental law was unified into a single act, the way some other areas of law are, the tax code, for example? Wouldn't it be tidy if there was an Environmental Protection Act, in which the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Drinking Water Act would all be together and in one? And wouldn't that be the sort of the next generation, looking ahead 50 years? Wouldn't that be where we want to get to? We had the first generation that put the foundations into place, the second generation that adapted it, probably still is adapting it, but the third generation that would codify it. I honestly don't know that is even doable. And even if it is doable, whether it's desirable, that too much might be lost, that is the social capital of environmental law. All the hard-fought compromises got us to where we have what we have, and whether we might accidentally move backward if we moved in that direction. So I have to think that the next 50 years is not about completely overhauling environmental law, but instead covering some things that are still not covered. Heaven knows there are considerable areas in which we don't currently have a social compact on, which is, a statute is kind of a social compact. We don't yet have that. And that moving ahead is importantly continuing the laying of the foundation, that the environmental law is not done, and there's more to do in just laying the foundation. So I'm wondering if that's the work of the next 50 years, but I'm also eager to hear what everybody else is answering to that question. And so listening to your all the interviewees on this last question, I think could be instructive, but that would be what I might offer in as a starter.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think everyone answers the question a little differently, but it all tends to be relatively hopeful.
Yeah.
Like environmental law, it's not a dead or a dying field. It's growing, and it becomes more and more important as we uncover new issues that we might not have thought about before.
Yeah, I bet that's right. I bet the arc is one of improvement. Slow, not as quick as we wish, but I bet the arc bends toward better environmental law, not worse.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been very educating. Unless there is anything else that you want the listener to know, I think that's all I have.
Well, thank you. What a pleasure to be part of the podcast, and thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Have an amazing day.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.